Welcome to the first of three lectures that are going to examine the connections between various theoretical perspectives and domestic violence. Here in part one of this three-part lecture series, we're going to take a brief look at the role that biological and psychological factors may play in the phenomenon of domestic violence. One of the things that I want us to keep in mind as we go through each of these lectures is to think about the importance of theories. Theories help us to explain a particular phenomenon. You know, who is more likely to engage in violence? Who's more likely to engage in crime? Who's less likely? Things of that nature. Theories also help us to create sort of predictive models by identifying various factors that are associated with some outcome. Then we can potentially identify potential perpetrators, potential victims, etc. But the key takeaway that I want us to remember, and I'll stress it throughout each of these lectures, is rarely is it one factor alone that leads to domestic violence or the occurrence of domestic violence. More often than not, there is an interplay of many factors, and some of those factors sort of help to sort of serve as catalyst to ignite the situation to make it even worse or more caustic. So one of the things we want to keep in mind is whenever you're examining a particular case or incidence of domestic violence, don't rely on one theory alone. Oftentimes it's important to think about what are components of various theoretical perspectives. And that's one of the things we're going to try to stress as we go through this. So we'll start off today with looking at biology, looking at ENA theory very briefly, as well as some of the scientific research that has shown associations between various hormone levels and domestic violence. And then we'll dive into an analysis of psychological factors. Specifically, we'll focus on various personality traits, mental disorders, and then a very important thing in the realm of domestic violence is sort of this general concept of communication or effective communication. The readings that will go along with this lecture are from chapter 4 of your course textbook. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we look at biology, and many of you who have taken other courses or criminology theory courses, you think back to the biological positivists, right? Atavism, and then physiognomy and phrenology, studying the brain, studying body shapes, looking for genetic issues. Well, some of that still holds true in domestic violence research and domestic violence theories. And a couple of things that I think are relevant specifically to this field of domestic violence is one of them is a theory known as the evolutionary neuroandrogenic theory, otherwise shortened to be ENA theory. And this is one that we've seen related to other areas where to say like the reason why humans behave the way they do is because quote unquote we are pre-wired for certain things. It's sort of the survival of the fittest, our biological instincts to survive and propagate and things of that nature are hardwired into our anatomy. And that's where this ENA theory comes from. And in a nutshell, the theory proclaims that females have a natural desire for aggressive males. So already that's creating potentially a dangerous situation, right? If one of the things about domestic violence is it does mean that there is some sort of aggression or violence in the relationship. And so when people are naturally drawn towards the aggressive of another sex or a potential mating partner, then having that desire may be problematic. Also, according to ENA theory, is the argument that strong competitive males are the ones who survive and propagate and reproduce. And therefore their lineage survives over the course of the millennia. But both of these, and we can sort of see, like going back to ancient humankind days, the idea for where survival is the number one sort of thing that's on your mind all the time. Then we can see that looking for the strong, aggressive, competitive mate would get you through. Now, obviously, that also opens the door to that strong, aggressive mate sometimes turning their focus of aggression back on you as their spouse or partner. Now, why is that a problem in modern society? Well, because the way that medical science and society has evolved, things like being overly aggressive, overly strong and competitive sometimes may not be the best suited thing for existing in a large world. And so this is where this idea of ENA theory has sort of made its foothold in the realm of domestic violence. Now, also with biology, we don't just focus on specific theories like the ENA theory. A lot of the modern research looking at biology and its connections to all sorts of human behaviors is at sort of at the hormonal level. So one of the things we want to look at is which particular hormones, either being overly high levels or low levels, have an influence on domestic violence. So two of them that often sort of correspond, especially in domestic violence research, is sort of being sort of a balance play, are testosterone and serotonin. Now, most of us are familiar with the idea of testosterone being a steroid hormone that is involved with male sexual drive, male sexual development. Also, muscle and bone mass are tied into testosterone, whereas serotonin is sort of our mood stabilizer. And when we have our sense of mood and well-being is tied into appropriate levels of serotonin. When serotonin levels get particularly low, we see strong connection with things such as depression. So let's look at sort of the interplay of testosterone and serotonin in the research examining domestic violence. So first, one of the things that domestic violence batterers tend to have higher levels of testosterone and lower levels of serotonin. So you can imagine this is a sort of a dangerous combination, higher sort of male aggression, sex drive, strength, things of that nature with the higher testosterone, as well as the mood stabilizer serotonin is too low. So there's a sense of confusion, depression. And so these two things, when they go hand in hand, have been connected with domestic violence. Also, we have looked at people with extremely high levels of testosterone has shown a link to engaging in violent crime. But even having abnormally low levels of testosterone is not necessarily put you in the clear. Low levels are sometimes linked to nonviolent crimes. Now, when it comes to testosterone, the findings are sort of similar in both male and female samples. So where you have testosterone tend to be above average, you tend to have people tend to be a little bit more violent, aggressive, and you can see how that may play into things such as domestic violence. And then abnormally low levels are into certain things such as more of the crimes like drug use, which are often tied in with depression as well. So these sort of non-violent crimes in that nature. And then one of the things is whenever we have an imbalance of one or both of these hormones, we tend to have sort of this weird play of overreaction. That's the high testosterone, right? And then also the excessive fear. That's sort of the low serotonin, which plays into, so you may not read a situation appropriately if you're in a relationship with somebody else. So you tend to overreact at the slightest thing. You tend to be fearful. Maybe, are they cheating on me? Is there something going on? And you can see how the play of these things can really become a dangerous thing. And then also, high levels of testosterone tend to affect social expression. So not just that you tend to be sort of aggressive and outspoken and angry, but also sometimes it may serve to inhibit communication. And we'll see that in a few minutes when we get into looking at psychology. One of the key factors is your ability to communicate. And so you'll start to see the interplay of not just one factor versus another, but also biology versus psychology versus social situations really become a big part. Some other hormones that we would like to examine from a biological point of view are epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. So we think of sort of like adrenaline, the fight or flight rush, when we think of epinephrine and norepinephrine. When we think of when our sort of anxiety or fear levels go up, that is tied into cortisol production. So all these are the key sort of hormones for our classic idea of fight versus flight. Once again, plays in very much perfectly into that domestic violence situation. How does one person particular handle any sort of social conflict, an argument, a debate, all things that happen on a daily basis, whether you are in a relationship, whether you're dating, whether you're married. These are things that maybe not at the survival level, but at just, the mundane, what are we going to have for dinner type thing? What time are you going to be home? We have debates, we have conversations. And so this sort of fight or flight thing can even bring itself into situations like that. These hormones have been shown to have connections to our ability to control behavior. And so obviously, if you're running high with levels of epinephrine and your adrenaline's pumping, then your ability to act clearly and behave in a rational manner are going to be inhibited. One of the key things that I would like to point out for this is the effect of cortisol. And the scary thing is there's more and more research showing that prolonged exposure to cortisol in children has long-term effects down the line as far as their levels of fear and anxiety. And we look at the fact that there's been a link between domestic violence batterers and showing heightened levels of fear and anxiety. That is something that to take note of. So how do children have prolonged exposure to cortisol? Well, if you're raised in an environment where there's domestic violence or abuse or neglect in the household, as a child, you're constantly in a state of fear and uncertainty, right? You're constantly sort of in that fight or flight type of feeling just to get through every day. It's not like you feel like you're in a comfortable nest where everyone's going to be taken care of, your food's going to be there, you're going to get, the appropriate hugs and kisses at night, and then everything's nice and happy. No, a child in an anxious environment where there's violence, abuse, or no one's around, or all sorts of things, if they're living in that continual state of heightened cortisol levels, that can have effects as they mature into adulthood, where their ability to contain and control fear and anxiety is inhibited. And it may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but in fact, oftentimes we do see that individuals who are the abusers, who are the batterers, actually have higher levels of fear and anxiety. And just it's the way that they respond to it and express it is what often leads them to act out aggressively towards their partner or spouse in an abusive manner. Now, as I've gone through these things, whether it's the ENA theory or an examination of different types of hormones and their connection in biology, a lot of them that I really want to stress is that biological theories are essential for providing an understanding of why other types of theoretical perspectives are likely to have a stronger or weaker impact on individuals. So as we go through and look at psychological factors, family, social, community factors, and then we'll see different people are going to respond to different family or social environments that are going to respond differently than other individuals. And so if we take a further look and step back and realize not everyone's going to react to the same social situation in the same way, we start to appreciate the role that biology and hormone levels can play. And thinking further in the course, when we start to think about, well, how do we help both victims and perpetrators of domestic violence? One of the key things and one of the avenues that a lot of research focuses on is checking, medical checkups, psychological assessment to assess the levels of various hormones in humans. And then if they're off, if there's an imbalance, look to medicate or other ways to potentially restore the balance. And that may be a way to, save a relationship or avoid potential issues of domestic violence. So let's go ahead and turn the page to another sort of theoretical area, and that is psychology. And psychology I'm going to break down into sort of three categories. Once again, sort of looking for what are some of the traits that continue to pop up when research examines situations of domestic violence and says, what are the factors that consistently sort of show up in these situations where, abusers or batterers, what is the similarity between them? So In the realm of psychology, the first of the three areas we're going to go through is personality traits. Then we'll progress into talking briefly about mental disorders and then finally about communication. So let's start a little bit with taking a closer look at various personality traits that have been linked to domestic violence, abusers, or batterers. So higher levels of anger, higher levels of hostility, a lack of self-control, higher levels of anxiety, excessive fear, we saw some of the biological foundations for these psychological traits on the previous slides. That's what I mean by there's a lot of interconnection, right? We saw that higher levels of cortisol, imbalances in epinephrine and norepinephrine can impact anxiety and fear. Also low self-esteem. So all these things shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that research has shown that people who tend to be more angry are more likely to abuse. People who engage in hostility at a high level, of course. People unable to control themselves. But then we look at anxiety, fear, and low self-esteem. These are the ones that sometimes I think people go, on the surface doesn't necessarily make sense for an abuser to think an abuser is feeling anxious or fearful or has low self-esteem. But in fact, it's when people suffer from some of these issues, the way we react doesn't always match what's going on inside of our body or our brains. So yes, there is connection between all these things. The second realm of psychological factors that we're going to look at are mental disorders. So which mental disorders do we see tend to have a stronger connection with domestic violence than others? So disorders that have been linked to domestic violence abusers tend to people who, once again, sort of counterintuitive, but it's there, people who have higher levels of depression. Sometimes their way of acting out is almost at the other extreme. They may be depressed inside, but they may act out in a harsh or aggressive manner towards those that they care for or those that they love. Or schizophrenia, intermittent explosive disorder. And in fact, when we look at offenders, domestic violence offenders in particular, male domestic violent offenders are 13 times more likely than non-offenders to be mentally ill. So once again, when we think about how to prevent and examine and predict the likelihood of domestic violence, qualitative or quality assessments of various mental issues or mental disorders is key to identifying some of the causes for why people engage in this type of behavior. Now, the third area of psychology that we're going to talk about is the role of communication. And so we think, well, what is community? When I think of psychology, I think of the things that I saw on the previous slide, like how I think, how I feel, things that natures. But communication is also deeply tied into our psychology in and of itself. And one of the key things that research is showing is that a strong connection between domestic violence and the inability to effectively communicate is one of the strongest predictors of or factors that is associated when people report and communicate stories about domestic violence. So where did we get to communication? Well, let's start with one of the greatest markers or identifiers or factors that's associated with the potential for abuse is somebody who displays a lot of generalized anger and hostility. So you go, okay, so anger and hostility, that sounds like sort of your psychology issues. So people with high levels of generalized anger and hostility tend to be much more likely to engage in abuse in any sort of relationship. Now, why is that? It's not just the anger and hostility. It's the fact that when somebody has a lot of anger and hostility, maybe it's because they're ineffective at being able to communicate, right? One of the things that we've all been there, I imagine each and every one of us listening to this have been in conversations about some issue. Like I said, it could be as mundane as what should we have for dinner tonight? What movies should we watch? Or, which is the better sports team? What's the better, decision to vote on this political proposition? Whatever it is, from mundane daily stuff up to intense debates with other people, sometimes you're in a conversation with somebody and you realize, I can win this debate. I've got a stronger argument. I can actually get my point across, and I'm going to either convince the other person that I'm right, or I'm going to get them to change their stance. I can win this debate because I have all the words and the arguments and all these things, and I feel confident, right? So when you're in that situation, all of a sudden there's a sense of confidence. But I imagine also we've all been in conversations with other people where all of a sudden we realize I can't win this conversation. Either I don't know the words to say, or I'm getting frustrated because this person is throwing all these facts and arguments at me and I don't have time to think. And what happens then when all of a sudden you're on the downside of that sort of debate or argument? You start to get frustrated. Your searching for words and your ability to find words gets even harder. You know what you feel, you know what you want to say, but you can't convey it in the right way. And that other person is coming with you with all sorts of other strong arguments. And so you start to get a little bit scared or mad or angry. And all of a sudden, that you can imagine for somebody who's unable to win those arguments or to communicate their true feelings, all of a sudden they get frustrated, they get scared. And that scared and that fear and frustration oftentimes can turn into anger and hostility as a way to react. So this ineffective communication really is an important area to think about, especially when we're examining cases of domestic violence and trying to mitigate the likelihood of domestic violence, trying to assist couples who have had issues, is trying to stress this idea of communication. And it's almost become like a bad cliche. The best way for a good relationship is you need to have proper communication, or our inability to communicate. But it's true. If people are not able to or not willing to express how they really feel, then both parties are missing part of the puzzle and they can't communicate. So where does ineffective communication really dive into it? Let's look at the bullet points at the bottom of the slide, right? The inability to argue in a mature manner is a sign of, that's what ineffective communication is in the first place, right? And I say they're in a mature manner, right? All of a sudden you resort to yelling, to screaming, to some more sort of visceral reactions, more so than the higher level intelligent reactions. When people are poor at debating, and then also it's not just with a partner or a spouse. Oftentimes it's how we communicate with people of different ages. And so when we've talked about the broader umbrella of domestic violence, sometimes it's brought into the home, and it's not just against a partner or spouse. The harm is also done to the children, and sometimes because adults have trouble communicating with children. It's one of those things like it's hard to sit here as an adult and remember that you're talking to an 8 or 9-year-old who has an 8 or 9-year-old brain. And so even as an adult, you feel smarter, more mature, you understand the world better, but you may still be ineffective at communicating if you can't allow in your own mind to think and remember what the world would look like through the mind of an 8 or 9-year-old. And then when you're trying to convince them of something or tell them what to do and they just don't understand, and you don't have the right words to communicate, then all of a sudden, guess what? You resort back to fear, anger, hostility, that sort of those visceral reactions, which can lead to bad outcomes. And one of the things that research has finally shown when looking at communication so far is that women tend to be better with communication and sharing than men. And this may be one of the reasons why we see a stronger connection between men engaging, being sort of the abusers or instigators of domestic violence more so than women. Now, obviously, this is not across the board, but there have been a handful of studies who have shown that on average, women are better with showing signs of higher level of effective communication and sharing thoughts and feelings more so than men. So then finally, we have to look at, okay, so ineffective communication, and this is going to be something that we will see come up not just through other theoretical perspectives, but also as we start to get into examining the roles of different players in the domestic violence phenomenon. But ineffective communication itself is important to understand as being something that, and also a target point of how we can, if we can improve communication in relationships, we may be able to reduce rates of domestic violence. So I personally think that's a really important thing. But also, we have to think about what happens when ineffective communication is combined with other psychological issues. So looking here, so ineffective communication, when it's combined with low levels of self-esteem, negative emotionality, or an immature personality, can even further heighten the likelihood of violence. And so it's not just ineffective communication itself, but these things together, all of a sudden you have, it's a synergistic effect where things are even more powerful than they are individually. So low self-esteem, right? So if somebody is unable to effectively communicate with a partner or spouse, and they also have a sense of a feeling that there is a power imbalance in a relationship, and they can't sort of express that sense of where they feel, and that they feel that they're at a lower level than the other individual, that they are the lower person as far as the power balance, and they're unable to sort of alleviate that or communicate that with their partner in order to seek out opportunities to equal the power, then that sort of low level of self-esteem combined with the inability to effectively communicate can cause that person to act out in anger or aggressive manners. Negative emotionality. So when somebody is the person who is, I don't want to downplay and say it's like the consummate pessimist, but it kind of is, right? It's a person who, if stress enters their life, they have negative reactions, probably even more extreme than they need to. They also expect more from other people than what would be appropriate to expect of partners, family members, or even strangers. So when you have this underlying sense of negative emotionality that you're walking around with, and then once again, you combine it with the inability to effectively communicate how you're feeling and what your expectations of people are, you can see how that may result in sort of bad behavior or bad outcomes. And then obviously, individuals with an immature personality. Oftentimes we'll see that in their mind, the blame does not fall on them. It has to fall on somebody else. And if you can't communicate that effectively to somebody else, that's what you're feeling, then there is hostility on both sides of the relationship. So as we've looked through these biological and psychological factors, you'll notice outside of that very first theory, the ENA theory that we just briefly touched on, the bigger focus has been not on any particular theories, but more on factors that would sort of create the pieces or the constructs of a larger combined theory. And so what we sort of stress here are what are some of the biological factors that we may sort of consider that may play a role in the domestic violence situation, and also what are some of the psychological factors. And as we move on to our next series of lectures, the next two, where we look at social factors within the family and the community, as well as the role of things such as substance abuse and how that can impact a domestic violence relationship, then in your mind, I encourage you to think about like not looking at one theory in particular, but rather look at little pieces, the factors, the constructs that could build into much more of a larger integrated theory to sort of explain what we see in any domestic violence situation. But also, those factors, those are also points at which we can target when trying to reduce the likelihood of domestic violence, or to help people as they recover, or to try to get them to desist from engaging in harmful domestic violence acts. So keep those things in mind as we move on to our next theory lecture. So I'll see you at theory lecture 2 in a bit. Take care.